just click yes to continue. Okay, looks like we're good to go. And I'll hand over to Leslie.
Awesome.
Take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I am, it's a bit of a giddy week as we were chatting, as everybody was sort of joining today. I'm on my first work trip in more than a year. In fact, I started with scrum.org on March 9th of last year. So 4 days before the US went into lockdown. So I'm up in our offices in Burlington, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston this week. And it's like, I actually like work with real human beings that aren't on the other side of a computer screen. So it's exhausting and overwhelming and awkward in a lot of ways, but also very like joyous and energizing. So I'm glad to kind of have that energy in me as I come to talk to y'all today. So I'm gonna go ahead and share screen, and then I'm gonna rejigger how I see all of you on the screen here. I've got my slides over on a monitor on this side. And we will have some interactive components as we go on today. So you're not just going to have to listen to me talk as we think about this whole idea of diversity and diversity starting with I. So let's see if we can get the slides to advance properly. There we go. Excellent. So I'm Leslie Morse, as they were saying, and I do work with scrum.org. My focus has recently shifted here to really starting to look at how we handle community and organizational development, which includes support and engagement with our overall PST community. So if you're ever interested in that path and want to know more about it, feel free to reach out to me. LinkedIn is the best way to connect if you want to ask follow-up questions after this session or anything. So just search for me there. Would be more than happy to chat with y'all. Disclaimer, I am not an expert in diversity, inclusion, DEI as a whole thing, but that is what we are going to talk about today. And really, we're going to start exploring it from the perspective of what are some of the knowledge and mental models that can allow us as agilists to create more inclusive environments, and what work we need to do with ourselves. So this is, right, when we think about overall diversity, equity, and inclusion, and those three things going together, I think about this in pursuit of how we create environments where people from all identities and backgrounds and everything just come together and thrive. And so much of that is true for us as agilists when we just even take the tiny slice of we're building cross-functional teams. And how does DEI show up in there as well? Even though diversity, equity, inclusion is such a larger global conversation these days. And so the inclusion part of it, like I said, is where we're going to dig in and talk today. And I want us to start off with maybe let's even, I think we'll stick with triad conversations and hopefully get some engagement. With just 5 minutes in triads, a conversation about what inclusion means to you. And then we'll come back and we'll do a debrief about what you all talked about in those discussions. So if you can fire off some triad style breakout rooms, that would be awesome.
Okay, just being set up now.
Or actually, wait, hold up. I'm going to change my mind. There's a small enough of us group here. Let's not go into triads. Let's just have an open conversation with all of us together. So when we frame this question, right, what does inclusion mean to you? What comes up for y'all? What do you think of? Go for it.
I mean, the obvious is the opposite of excluding people. So seeking to actively include people who might otherwise be excluded for whatever reason. Although that's a bit of a cop-out.
If I add something to that, then it's that inclusion is not, it's something that you actively design for, pursue, you actually actively incorporate in whatever we're doing. You don't passively allow it to happen.
Yeah.
I think it's creating a space where everyone feels that they belong.
I think that was where I was going to kind of point us to, is how would we know if inclusion was happening when people have a sense of a feeling of belonging? To me, is one of those indicators. Anybody else around what inclusion means?
Yeah, I mean, something that I want to add.
Whoa!
Sorry, just give me a sec.
Oh, you're talking on mute.
Okay.
You're talking on mute.
Or we just can't hear you.
Yes.
Okay, I don't know if I can add.
Yeah, go, Carol.
For me, okay, for me, it's the presence of psychological safety in its own way. So it means I am welcome at the table, my views are valid and they're seen as such. It may be different from yours, but you allow my views to be heard.
Yeah.
That's inclusion for me.
Yeah, and just kind of furthering on Carol's point, you know, it's not just about, you know, including people physically, or, you know, including them for any specific reason. It's also their thoughts as well, and understanding that every single person has a different thought process or has different ideas, and rather than discrediting some and taking others, how you can bring them all together.
Absolutely.
Maybe inclusion means feeling part of something rather than siloed. I may be wrong, but
I just want to add as well. To me, is inclusion is like a universal human rights. So, you know, regardless of the gender, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of whatever you are actually including within like a community coming together.
Yeah, absolutely. Y'all are pointing a lot of the places that I think about when we think about diversity and inclusion. And this idea that diversity starts with I is the important part here, right? I don't believe, and from conversations that I've had and studies that I've done in this whole area, diversity will never exist if inclusivity is not already present. It is like the door opening to allow diversity to enter. And the I perspective of our own work in terms of what we do to be inclusive of ourselves and others. And that's actually the piece that we're going to tease out today, is how all of this work and these conversations around DEI and for inclusion to exist, some of it actually starts with us as individuals. There's a quote that I learned about in, I guess it was summer of 2019. I was interviewing Portia Tung about the art of play and how it works in organizations. And she dropped this quote on me in the middle of the interview for the Women in Agile podcast, which I happen to host if you're interested in following a new podcast. But it's, you cannot give what you don't have. And for whatever reason, that quote has really, really stuck with me in terms of just the world that I aspire for us to live in, what it means to work at an organization like scrum.org that is in the business of helping people and teams solve complex problems. How can we achieve that mission if we're not doing that work ourselves? So what do we have that we can actually give to others, and how all of this works together? And so the idea of, if we don't have inclusivity of ourselves, how can we ever begin to go create it with others? This idea of it starting with I and starting with self, specifically mindset, to me is really important. In fact, I think the mindset is really a foundational element of enabling the systemic shifts that we're talking about when we think about the global DEI movement that is at the forefront of so many conversations in ways that it wasn't even 12 months ago. And so it's sometimes as simple as, how do you talk to yourself? If I'm forever shooting myself down and having self-limiting beliefs exist, and I'm telling myself I'm stupid and my ideas aren't good enough, and I'm in this whole negative self-loop talk, and I'm not inclusive of my own thoughts, the things that you all were pointing to about diversity of thought and diversity of background and all of these kind of things, if I can't do it for myself, how am I ever going to give that and create the space for others? And so there's a little bit of knowledge is power here in terms of knowing thyself. What are the mental models that are important? How can you use those mental models to help know other people better, and building of empathy? We're going to talk about psychological safety just a little bit. And so a good bit of this talk today is going to get, I guess I'll say a little theoretical, but this is the work, and what I'm exposing and kind of unzipping today is the things that I'm thinking about and doing on my own journey to be a better ally, to be a better leader, to create space for inclusivity to exist and everything. And so what I'm hoping is you'll find some inspiration on what you can do yourself in order to start shifting your ways of thinking to create inclusivity within yourself and with space for others. And so we are going to start with some kind of geeky theory. Who here is familiar with the work of Robert Keegan? Anybody? He is sort of one of the leading experts on adult developmental theory. So this really is how adult learning happens, how the adult brain makes sense of the world, how it evolves over time. And so there's 5 stages of adult development. Stage 1 and stage 2 are rarely talked about in lots of conversations because the impulsive mind, or stage 1, is very much early childhood. Stage 2, the imperial mind, is kind of, from a biological perspective, very much associated with adolescence and only 6% of adults. And so when we look at stages 3 through 5 and how people just orient themselves to the world around them, the important thing here from a mental model perspective for me is if the majority of the population that we interact with exists in an adult developmental state of what are the rules around me, I just must follow them, that is inherently, to some extent, a non-inclusive adult developmental state, because we're just following those rules. We're not necessarily, unless our societal rules systemically shift to create inclusion as a natural rule, people aren't used to kind of working in a way where inclusivity would be a normal thing because you're so ingrained to what is around you. And so as you move on, and if you do sort of the right kind of work and right self-offering mind or self-transforming mind, the natural inclusivity becomes more inherent into the way you orient yourself to the world around you. And it brings up this question around, like, what is the truth? And more importantly, can you, and somebody pointed to this a minute ago, can you handle multiple conflicting ideas as true at the same time? And so how many of you would say, like, oh, I am consciously aware that I can look at 2 pieces of conflicting input and say that both of them are true at the same time? Like, how much of that, how does that idea resonate with you?
I feel like Dylan's trying to, yeah.
Sorry, David. And Dylan, we want to hear you. We see you keep trying to talk. But David, what were you saying?
I was just going to say, I mean, I talk about this with my therapist quite a lot. I don't think it's much of a revelation that I'm in therapy for people who know me. But yeah, it's this idea that you have perspectives. And so I just said in the chat that I sort of have a slightly different approach to identity, which is the I that I am is merely a separator between where I have been in the past and what's coming. And I don't know what that is, but that does allow me, I mean, the way I think, therefore, is probably less about all these are conflicting ideas that are true. They are merely true from different perspectives.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily imply there's actually conflict there.
Right. Yeah. I like that, actually, that slight reframing, David. Because it sort of takes that idea of right and wrong, truth or false out of it, because that's really not actually what it's about. But it is that recognition of that. I completely agree. Anybody else?
One thing to add to that as well is that the context can also influence or dictate how we are seeing things and how we do things. So sometimes like a lot of these things will be contextual. So I can imagine that we can actually have multiple conflicting ideas. It just gives, going to what David was saying, the perspective can also, context and can give you a different perspective and interpretation.
Yeah. I distinctively remember when I was working with my own coach, having lots of conversations around feeling like I was crazy. When all of a sudden I sort of moved beyond this like need of achieving things and need of being right and being the expert in the room on stuff. And then all of a sudden it's like I could see that so much gray space we live in. Like being crazy is a bad thing. And that was kind of what I realized is the ability to see that, those that are not, as somebody asked for like what an example of conflicting ideas is. So it's like when you argue against yourself and you're playing devil's advocate and both sides of the argument are absolutely equally possibly the best thing to do, that there really is no right. And so it's like, but this could be true and that could be true and this could also be true. And if this and that are true at the same time, like that doesn't seem like it should be possible. Like you kind of feel neurotic. And it's really like, until I realized, oh, all of these things can be simultaneously true or perspectives can be valid, I really did sort of feel like a crazy person to some extent. And what I realized is the ability to be inclusive and the ability to allow all of this diversity to thrive, I believe is going to be unlocked by more people stretching into vertical development versus horizontal development. And this is why I said this is a little bit theoretical and a little bit geeky, but I have a hypothesis that a shift in how all of us as agilists work and how all of us as global members of global society work, this is going to be a key to building greater inclusivity in our teams, in our companies, in our communities, and in the global society that we all live. So horizontal development from a definition perspective is really about the acquisition of new knowledge and skills, right? I now know, right? You all now that didn't know about Robert Keegan before and the stages of adult development, a little bit of horizontal development happened. You are now aware that this knowledge exists in the world. Right. So that idea, I now know Scrum, I now know Kanban, I know story pointing is a technique. I'm learning knowledge about psychological safety, whatever it is, the learning and acquisition of knowledge is horizontal development. Vertical development is the work you do that actually changes the way your mind comprehends things, makes sense of the world around you, and kind of uplifts your consciousness. So if you think about horizontal development as like all of this knowledge I have, every piece of it is like a different app on my phone, right? And my vertical development is like my operating system. We all know that not all apps work on all operating systems. So sometimes in order to start using this new app, I've got to upgrade the operating system so that it can come online. And so while a minute ago I said knowledge is power, I do take a little bit of I have a beef with the very popular Maya Angelou quote, because you know better, you can do better. I might have acquired the knowledge, right? I can sit down and read all day long about what it means to be a good servant leader. But it doesn't mean I can actually put that knowledge into action until I do the vertical development work of changing how I orient to the world around me. And then all of a sudden, those apps start firing. And so and this is how it relates, is like, that's the journey I've been on. I realized investing in vertical development all of a sudden was like how I could start doing all of these things I theoretically knew were true. And so paying attention to the fact that both of these exist, I think is a linchpin in creating more inclusive environments. And so
Just
anybody?
one question, if you don't mind. I may ask?
Yeah.
Right, okay, yeah. So is it not like you need to have, for vertical development, you need to have a horizontal development first?
There's definitely a relationship to them. And for me, part of it was the horizontal development and the knowledge acquisition that vertical development actually existed. So I had to have the knowledge that the other axis was there for me to even start doing that work. So that at its base level, right, is true. And so the Dunning-Kruger effect comes into here, like the you don't know what you don't know quadrant, and the you don't know it quadrant. And that idea of like all of a sudden, like I'm in imposter syndrome, and I'm going to be stupid at everything for the rest of my life because there's so much I don't know. This balance of learning about the things and doing something with them is all wrapped up in that Dunning-Kruger effect and all of that sort of stuff. I'm not an expert in any of this. This is really just how I'm doing my work and how, for me, the work to create more diversity, equity, and inclusion, I start thinking about this stuff from the foundational perspective so that I actually take actions to shift the environments that I'm in. Anybody read Reinventing Organizations or looked at spiral dynamics in the work of Lelou? So if you're familiar with that idea of spiral dynamics, I kind of call Torbert's work around action logics the human side of spiral dynamics. And so similar to the 5 stages of adult development from Keegan, the action logics are different leadership stances and sort of evolutions of how we orient ourselves to the idea of leadership. And so there's a wonderful Harvard Business Review article, if you just Google, right, leadership development profile, action logics, where you can learn about all of these. But again, right, there's a thing around like only a certain percentage of the population is really at a leadership action logic where we're inherently primed to create inclusive environments, and that those skills really start kicking in and those perspectives really start kicking in at this idea of individualist and beyond. And so the reason all of this foundational theory, I believe, is important is because, one, there's a self-serving aspect for it for us as agilists. We as agilists are inherently in the people business and needing to create ground conditions for change and new ways of thinking and innovation to occur. So if we want to be successful as agilists, if we want to have the mindset necessary to give to others where all of this can flourish and thrive, doing our own work to advance our stages of adult development, our action logics and ways of leading will give us what we need to go help create it in others. We've inherently been training for this because we are always working to try to create value more rapidly, look at empiricism, learn new things, inspect and adapt as we go. And I think we have a really, really unique opportunity to leverage the Agile movement as a way to start working on ourselves in different ways and affecting the whole world around us. In fact, I venture to say, like, we could use our role as agilists to reach a tipping point of enough people in the world that can unlock the next wave of what society has to offer and the way that we interact with each other as humans. Lisa Adkins and I really, really geek out on this topic in the episode that came out last week of the Women in Agile podcast, where we talk about like the higher calling for those that are in the Agile coaching space. And so the other piece of this is that we are always in relationship, right? We're in relationship with ourselves and everyone else around us. And if we can sort of believe that to be true as well, we can start linking up 4 or 5 mental models that can help us actually do the knowledge acquisition that'll help us do all of this work. And so the first thing that has been inspiring to me that I encourage you to go take a look at is the work of Anne Rod and Marita Frijan in the book, Creating Intelligent Teams. And they have what's called the Principles of Relationship Systems Intelligence. So if we go back to that DEI sort of mission that I talked about at the beginning, right? How do we create environments where people from all identities and backgrounds thrive, right? All of us are in relationship with each other, right? What is the unique identity of that relationship that we have with each other? How is everyone's voice in that system honored? Which means I might have to accept, right, perspectives that are not my own as also true. How do we come from a place that this group that I am in is naturally creative, intelligent, and whole? It has all of the wisdom necessary for us to work together, right? We all belong to the same team, and change is normal. In fact, the fact that we use phrases like change management, I almost am starting to believe is an inherently not inclusive thing, because that implies change is a thing you can manage. Change fluency, I think, is the right term we should all be using. In the same ways that we become fluent in language, how do we become fluent in change? Because it is always emerging and occurring. And so that is an aspect of having an inclusive environment. And I understand how theoretical some of this sounds around the adult development and the way the brain works. But if we are artificially sort of holding ourselves back from thinking in the ways where all of this can be true, how will we ever create it? And so it's this weird, I don't know if it's kind of like, was it Schrodinger's principle, if the cat's in the box and you can't see the cat, is the cat alive or dead, sort of thing. Like, it feels like sort of what's the word I'm searching for? Existential sort of question in a lot of ways. But, right, studying the RSI principles and looking at those is huge. A couple weeks ago, I also did a psychological safety assessment with somebody certified by the Academy of Brain-Based Leadership. And this really changed my brain from a way of how do we cultivate a sense of belonging and how do we build the ground conditions where trust can exist, thus, right, being things that are directly correlated to inclusivity. And so if you haven't read this book around psychological safety, I just got it and have just started it. But the assessments and the resources available from the Academy of Brain-Based Leadership, I think, are really critical. There's so much talk about psychological safety from a theoretical standpoint. I'm not sure enough of us are actually studying it in meaningful ways so that we can know how to go create it. I can't tell you how many times I encounter somebody that just goes, oh, well, this is a safe place. Actually, the fact that you just said this is a safe place makes me feel less safe, because saying it's true doesn't mean it's actually true. So this is where I'm looking and where I'm studying around all of this. And then if you've never been to yourbias.is, they sell decks of cards, they sell this poster. We used this in a team that I was working on heavily last year to help us understand how our bias was showing up and getting in the way of our own decision making. And bias is so heavily involved in, right, us inadvertently creating exclusion versus inclusion. So it's really, it goes back to that knowledge is power sort of stuff. So these are the places that I'm studying from the I perspective so that I can create greater inclusion of myself and for others. So I'm curious for y'all, and we won't use Menti because we've got a small group. But what are some of the things when you all think about creating psychological safety, building the right environment where diversity can thrive and inclusion occurs? What are some of the mental models and the different tools that you all use? Ooh, clean language is a great one.
Are you familiar with rhizomatic thinking?
I am not.
Okay. So a rhizome is like a root. So if you think of ginger, that is a rhizome. And when it grows underground, it grows in any direction. It will bud off at any point in search of nutrients, and it will butt up against trees and suck the nutrients, that sort of thing. So rhizomatic thinking has no pattern, and it doesn't go woody like trees do. Arborescent thinking, well, trees, on the other hand, are woody. Once their roots have grown in a particular direction, they stay there. They don't sort of bud off randomly in another direction. So rhizomatic thinking is this idea that you can sort of link together ideas and concepts from all over the place, rather than being this sort of structured hierarchical way of thinking, which is sort of the arborescent way of thinking.
Yeah.
So that's one of many models that I use, but I think it's super relevant to what you've just been saying, because I think that's what you were saying. So rhizomatic thinking is, for me, sort of summarizes everything here.
Yeah, and David, you put something here in the chat around, the pragmatic school of philosophy accepts that models don't have to be true to be valuable. They need to promote useful conversations and perspectives. And so we often look at organizations using multiple contradictory models simultaneously. I think that's so true. And the reason this idea around the action logics is important is because with a significant percentage of people being at this expert level, they are going to naturally be geared towards making sense of the world in a way that whatever they believe is right. And if your model conflicts with mine, your model is wrong. They can't both be true, right? Which is further substantiated by, the Keegan sort of work around, I follow the rules, It's very wired to that expert and achiever style action logics. So this is where the knowledge and the power comes, by starting to have conversations like this one and exploring the vertical development that helps us actually work through and increase our stages of development and advance our action logics, the more of us that exist in the world that function at those levels, it will systemically change everything. And so I'll give you this last piece of sort of knowledge that is a little bit strange, and I didn't want to believe it at first. But in physics, there's this thing called the Law of Non-Locality. And the way I learned about it was from Marita Frijan, who was one of my teachers as I've done professional coach training and certification. Where from the pure physics perspective, it is the fact that two objects can exist in absence of each other, yet be intertwined and connected. And so kite surfing was the story that Marita told us to help us learn about the law of non-locality and how it applies to human-based relationships. So at one time in the world, it was somewhere in the 70s or the 80s. I don't remember the exact year. No human in the world had ever kite surfed. It just wasn't a skill anyone had. There were all sorts of people trying to link the idea of how to use a kite and have your feet on a board and use that for propulsion. But, no one had done it. And then this guy in South Africa one day just figured it out and did it. And the evidence shows that in the weeks following that, all of a sudden, other people around the world magically figured out how to do it too. It was like in the quantum space, his ability to have figured this out created systemic knowledge in the world that other people were able to tap into. It's like he broke the ice. And that's this idea of non-locality. It's so easy to sit and think well, I'm just one person. What can I really do to shift the world we live in and bring greater respect and bring greater kindness, have more diversity and have more inclusion. And if we can believe the law of non-locality is true, then we can have faith that the work we do on ourselves to change the sense making we have and the way we relate to the world around us is unlocking systemic wisdom that other people can tap into as well. This conversation we're having today is creating greater wisdom in the world, even though those other people are not here and part of this conversation. So like I said, it's a little bit geeky, it's a little bit theoretical, but for me, this is how diversity starts with I and the way that we relate to ourselves and the world around us. What are other mental models and tools? Like I see, right, Jose's dropping links into the chat. There's conversation happening there. What other things come up for you? And let's just kind of spend, I was about saving 15 minutes for Q&A, but just open discussion. I can be patient and quiet. I've seen head nodding as we've gone, like what's making sense or what's not making sense. Feel free to call BS on this, because like I said, I'm not an expert in it.
Well, this is making sense to me, Leslie, because I think you certainly the stuff about rhizomatic and arborescent thinking, so tree-like and rhizomatic thinking, is sort of at the core of my PhD argument, which I'm working through at the moment. So that's why that really resonated with me quite loudly. And my argument really is that real agility, however we're defining the word real here, and you know that's a whole problem in and of itself, is actually about switching to a rhizomatic way of thinking from an arborescent way of thinking. And that the narratives that you get in organizations should reflect that switch from sort of hierarchical tree-like thinking to much more, oh, that's useful, that's useful, that's useful, that's useful ways of thinking. Spoilers, I haven't finished writing it yet. But anyway, so I really like that idea. I kind of feel like I want to pull in more ideas and stitch, but you know, it's just been a really interesting conversation and has been really, I've had a really tough week and this has been really good for me. So thank you very much.
There's also a seeding kind of thing. And I think as an agile coach, you know, I work in an organization that has 17 teams. I can't possibly work in detail with all of those teams. But what I can do is I can drop in and I can ask the right question to drop a seed. I can suggest the right book to the right person. So I drop seeds all over the organization, and I do it out with the teams as well as inside the team, so across the business. So that's more seeding. It maybe it's rhizomatic, but it's also kind of, some of the seeds will grow and some of them won't. And it's really interesting to see which ones take root and which ones grow from there and which ones don't.
Yeah. And I think, Lynn, you're pointing to something interesting here, because I think that seed dropping is something lots of us do, whether consciously or unconsciously. So the question is, if we're called to be doing the work where we want those seeds to flourish, how do we become students of building fertile soil, right? So those seeds can germinate, right?
Gardeners of Agilis.
Yeah. And it can feel really selfish when you hire your first professional coach for you to work with, and you really start investing in your own vertical development journey. But you cannot give what you do not have. And so it's about fueling yourself and learning how to create your own fertile ground, so that those seeds take root within you. And then, right, it all becomes kind of, I don't want to use infectious because of the whole pandemic and like there's negative connotation to the word infection, but we used to talk about that idea of an idea being like a virus and taking root. But I love where you're pointing with that one.
Osmotic. Yeah.
Yeah.
I usually define. I mean, actually, I love the metaphor because I usually say that our work should be more closely associated to the idea of gardeners of ideas. So yeah, creating the right conditions, creating the right soil, plant ideas like people and ourselves. Germinate ideas, and which ones.
Yeah.
You cannot determine those, which goes into David's idea of and one thing that I think we do a lot many times is we prematurely start looking for conformity and standardization and agreements, and that can eliminate the opportunity of really, really good ideas actually happening later on. Yeah. So we jump into conclusions, we jump into conformity and things like that. We're still we seek certainty, we seek norms, we seek all these things when we should just be much more comfortable with hey, let it be.
Yeah,
control.
Yeah, and I can connect it as well to all the work that people like Daniel Metzik does with the whole thing about agile but change by invitation, rather than enforcing change or enforcing agility and things like that. So yeah, I've got a lot of connecting ideas right now. So
yeah, and it is it feels like magic the day you wake up and all of a sudden all these things start connecting and you realize I'm sitting in a meeting right now and all these people are disagreeing. We're in that, right? What Jose's pointing to is the divergent and convergent cycle where we have to what are all the ways we could do something? Now let's converge. And the fact that we short circuit that so much. Yeah. But the day you wake up and you realize I'm sitting here in this meeting and everybody's fighting about the right way to get something done. And you're like, I can be with this right now. I'm not anxious. I'm not wanting to force us to consensus. This process is going to serve us and allow it to all play out. The amount of weight that's on your shoulders that just kind of evaporates and the psychological overload of it is really fantastic. And it's a gift I wish I could just bottle and give to everybody.
I think we're seeing this convergence a bit because I've been going on and on about diversity and inclusion for, far too long. And it's really wonderful to kind of see other people discover these ideas. And it's new to them. It's kind of like watching children discover butterflies.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, there's this wonderful idea and it can make your organization better.
Yeah.
And I can tell you more about it. So it's really nice to see those ideas start to permeate, but it does seem like it happened all at once. We've been talking about diversity in organizations for 20 years, right? And it was always, what kind of diversity? And was it about race? Was it about ethnicity? Was it about gender? What was it about?
Yeah.
Was it about single parents versus people with no children? And that's how it kind of all started. But now it's really, in the last 18 months, it's really permeated industries that I never would have expected to see it in. And it's brilliant to see.
Awesome. I agree. And the fact, Lynn, that we have all been living in this pandemic state for more than a year now. And that inherently sort of forces us into a scarcity mindset. There was actual scarcity of physical resources for a while, scarcity of tests, scarcity of vaccines, all of this, right? We were legitimately living in a place of scarcity. And the sort of work that we're talking about to make all of this true requires more of an abundance mindset. And so the fact that these systemic shifts are starting to happen in more meaningful ways in a time of scarcity, holy cow, what's going to be possible when we really come out of the other side of this? If we can just sort of stay committed to the conversations and the curiosity.
Could I just pick up on a couple of things? I just wanted to say that even rhizomes have areas where they become woody and rigid, and trees have areas where they reach out. So, you can still have these big solid organizations which still have areas or sort of rhizomatic behavior, and you can still be a very rhizomatic person and still have areas where actually there is a hierarchy and you need the hierarchy in order to be able to make sense of the world. So it's, again, this sort of removes this idea that even within this fake binary, which suggests, oh, there's a different way of thinking, actually it's not even saying that. It's saying there are two ways of thinking, but actually, you need both of them sometimes. So that just makes that even more shades of gray rather than black and white.
Yeah, in fact, what I love you're pointing to here, David, is like the people that learn about spiral dynamics the first time, or even the action logics at the very beginning, it's like, oh, if you're not a teal organization, you're bad. When really, right, the healthy manifestation of a teal organization is one that has the situational awareness to know, in this context, we actually need to be orange or we need to be green, and that we have the range and the fluidity, dare I say fluency again, to choose the right action logic or to choose the right organizational development mode at the right time. And this is where that intersection, who was it that was asking about, right, like the horizontal versus vertical, and do you need the horizontal knowledge before the vertical happens? When you only have horizontal development around things like spiral dynamics and action logic and Keegan's work around adult developmental theory, you get oftentimes the unhealthy manifestations of it, because it's like, oh, you're not as good as me if you're not as in my same action logic, and you end up marginalizing those that have different action logics. And it's like, no, there is wisdom and value in all of them. It's about, all right, the first leadership development work I did was actually in Ken Blanchard's area of work around situational leadership. And that's really actually what it's all about.
Yeah.
Is the right thing at the right time.
I was just going to say, if you've just been involved in a car crash, you don't want somebody to sit down and discuss how we might get out of this. You want somebody to hold your neck still and tell you to stay still and stop the bleeding and put the fires out. You need to be directional, and you need to be hierarchical, and you need to be arborescent in that situation.
Yeah.
It's in your recovery that you need the rhizome, because it's at that point you need to start linking things together and making sense of it in your own head.
Yeah. I want a glass of lens wine, but it's only 1:55 p.m. here yet. I'm in the office, so that might not be.
It's lovely. End of a long day.
I believe there's an American singer who says something about it always being 5 o'clock somewhere.
Yes, this is true.
Hi, my name is Grace.
Hey, Grace.
Hey, Grace.
Yeah, from Nigeria. I wanted to ask, I've really been listening to you and I find the topic really interesting. Inclusion really starts with I. Within my short period of working with a diverse team, really diverse, I found that openness is actually a big barrier to inclusion and diversity.
Yeah.
Sorry, my kids are here. They might just shout at any time.
Don't apologize.
Okay. So and within my short period again of working with this diverse team, I also found that being that openness is a big problem. People find it really difficult to open up to people that really don't look like their kind, or people not within really from their geographical location. So how do we begin to break down the barriers of these barriers, the lack of openness, even when there is openness, equity is not on the table.
Yeah.
And then how do we start? I found I've talked with a lot of people, sometimes I get messages and then I set up a meeting and then we just have a very light chat. And one concern that probably somebody really new in the agile space that really been going to a lot of meetups. And the complaint was, agile is really a good concept. It's something that could heal the world, really create that diverse, inclusive, and equitable space. But I found people don't really practice what preach. So how do we begin to really practice agility?
I have a kind of answer, and it's around authenticity. You were talking about psychological safety earlier. If you create a psychologically safe space for people to be truly themselves and bring their authentic selves to work, places where they're okay to talk about every aspect of their life, right? So having the ability to talk about neurodiversity, gender diversity, LGBTQ, families, singleness, all of these things, to be your authentic self and not kind of leave who you are at the door. Once you have that authenticity, I think that's the key to opening agility, because then you truly are understanding one another as you are, rather than as you're pretending to be.
I agree. I agree with Lynn, and I think Grace is pointing to exactly. I have another talk and a conversation that I have with groups around the shadow sides of our industry. And one of the things that I talk about is we do not drink our own Prosecco. We are out there selling Prosecco, Agile, training it, coaching it, and all of it, and we never actually consume the product ourselves. It goes back to that quote I opened with. You cannot give what it is you do not have. We see a world of failed Agile transformations because the people out there leading Agile transformations do not know how to actually transform thyself. Or, right, and Lynn, I'd say that to some extent, you're giving us a little bit of a bridge too far. How do we create a work environment where this is, how do I just create that psychological safety in my own brain and between me and one other human? And then the next human I talk to, and the next human I talk to, and then that can become a triad.
I agree. Totally agree.
Yeah. So Grace, you were posing the exact world conundrum we are all living in right now. And I don't know of any other answer than turning people on to their own vertical development journeys, because the research tells us when you invest in that work, it changes how you make sense of the world around you. And you can inherently, from that position, create that authenticity that Lynn's pointing to. And I know no other way to achieve that.
I think there's a key bit too to becoming that authentic self and communicating it. And that's being willing to be vulnerable, willing to say, this is who I was before, and this is what I learned, and it helped me do better.
Great.
I didn't know this. I know it now. It helps me. Maybe it'll help you.
Yeah.
Great.
Can I just talk a bit? Can I just pick up a bit on authenticity?
First pause. We are technically at the top of our time box.
Oh, sorry.
Facilitators, may we continue?
You may. Yeah, go for it.
Thank you, Ahmad. Yeah, so I kind of wanted to bring in the concept of masks. So, you know, there's this common thing about whenever we're doing things, we're wearing a mask. It's like a role that we put on for the purposes of whatever the thing is that we're doing.
Like an avatar of ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, avatar is a really, really good word. But what I kind of like is the idea that not only are the masks that we put on the masks that we choose to put on, but also they only convey what is reflected by the masks being worn around us are. So really the masks we're wearing are supposed to maximize what's coming from other people. And I think this is sort of what you were talking about with authenticity, Lynn, as well. I think there's an element of congruence to that, about it being true to what you're feeling and the appropriateness of expression. And I also think there's about modeling behavior. Without, I don't want to talk about one thing too much, but there's an idea that actually if you're a bunch of Scrum Masters, Agile coaches within an organization, you should actually model the behavior that you want the organization to do. So this is about sipping your own Prosecco, and it's a way of being authentic and congruent and wearing masks that reflect the masks around you.
Integrity.
And so that's what I was going to say there, to move that from like a sort of fluffy conversation, which is important. We need those fluffy conversations, but actually you can take it to a really pragmatic dimension by just doing it, right? And yeah, it's uncomfortable, and your mask will change because it's reflecting other things, but that's the only way to learn.
Yeah, because it's easy to do as I say, not as I do. And Jose, I saw you were going to jump in. I also think, one, I want to give Grace a little bit more time to talk because we're running our mouths a lot. But two, Grace being vulnerable the way that you were is a piece of this authenticity. There's a concept called star walking that I've been familiar with, where you are the thing that you want to create in the world. Grace just star walked for us a few minutes ago. She was the openness that she wants to see in the world. And the law of non-locality is going to take an effect, and it's going to create more of that around us. So
Thank you.
Yeah, what else do you have to say?
Yes, I think my biggest takeout from this session is vulnerability. Yes, I think people wouldn't want to be open, or people wouldn't want to be vulnerable, maybe so they don't get judged by their past actions. But I think it's a big topic we really need to begin to talk about in Agile. Yes, I've had experiences where, yes, people I had worked with were not really open, and one almost came out confrontational, but, we had a chat and she was really vulnerable. And that was the best part for me. Like, nobody's perfect. I think it's a journey. Agility is a journey. And so when we begin to be vulnerable, speak out and say, yes, I might be an Agile coach. I might sound like an expert. I might have talked at a number of conferences, but I'm still not perfect. And so accept me the way I am. Probably that should be a disclaimer each time we have a talk like this. Yeah. Probably might help. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Grace. Jose, what were you going to add a minute ago?
I don't know. I'm having so many thoughts that I don't know where to go. Well, one thing that I was feeling about is there is a few dilemmas in this, because any sort of change, any sort of doing anything different, it requires an element of being uncomfortable, stepping into the unknown, courage to do things differently, and modeling all these things. Yeah, but the balance of that is that we've got to be able to be contextually aware, situationally aware. And sometimes what I've seen the mistake is that we try to we got to build, we talk about like making the fertile soil. We have to build the conditions for these things to happen. Sometimes we prematurely try to do too much. And then we become too exposed, too vulnerable, and there is a resistance to this because there is no conditions. I talk about the conference about being ready, willing, and able. Sometimes we push too quickly.
Yeah.
And there are dilemmas as well. I mean, certain organization, you go as an Agile coach and you think, oh, it's all about self-organization, but let me tell you all the answers. Yeah. Because if I don't tell you the answers, I'm going to be fired. Yeah. How do we balance all these things? How do we create the organization to be ready, be deliberate, try to go little by little, all that gradual process?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I just to summarize is like is being that contextually aware to be able to do this. But how far can we go?
Yeah. Yeah.
To change, to keep chipping at this.
Yeah. I think I'll leave it with this. If this sounds interesting to you and doing this work is interesting to you, and you don't know how to get started, it generally costs, from my experience, about $500 to get up with someone that is certified to do either the leadership development profile, the LDP, or the GLP, which is the global leadership profile. They're essentially the same thing in terms of exploring those action logics and what your action logic is, and understanding more about thyself, right? So you can do other in the world. That $500 investment that I made several years ago is the action that unlocked the shift in me. that, and I did a leadership circle profile, but it isn't as directly related to what we're talking about today. So if you want to know how to get started, like, you know, that doing that assessment is a great way to just learn about yourself, and the debriefs of that point you towards the resources and the things that you can do and learn about in order to make more shifts. So that's kind of the practical, like, where to go from here, how to actually make a difference piece of it. Thank you guys for having me.
Brilliant.
No,
Thank you.
all, not guys.
Everyone.
Yeah, that was fantastic, Leslie. So many
Yeah.
great talking points, lots of food for thought. So actually getting hungry now, it's dinner time. Yeah, awesome. So yeah, the session has been recorded, so we'll get it edited and sent out. For those who are attending Lean Agile Global next week as well, I think, Leslie, will you be there?
I will be around kind of virtually, but I'm not specifically like presenting or anything next week.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
And
think,
then
yeah.
I'll send you a PDF of the slides if you want to include that with the recording.
Sure, we'll do that. Okay, fantastic. All right, everybody, have a fantastic evening.
Been a pleasure.
Yes, thanks so much.
Thank you very
Thank
much. Like,
you.
great conversation. I really enjoyed that as well. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Leslie.
Yeah, you're
Thanks,
welcome.
everyone.
Yeah, and
Bye.
yeah, look out for our next event. Cool.